Okay, I'm going to go ahead and run through how to do repeated measure ANOVA in SPSS. So repeated measure ANOVA is a statistical test that is used when the same respondents are asked the same questions or measured in the same way at various points of time or under various conditions. And so what I'm using here is I'm using my former student Jackson Stoffel's data set, or at least part of it, to run this test. So what Jackson did was he had a variety of video clips that all depicted different animated characters. And each animated character that the person was exposed to through a survey, they were asked, how good or nefarious do you think that this character is? He was specifically looking at what sort of social signifiers he identified through thematic analysis were associated with people thinking that a character was good or evil. And the options that the respondents had was good, somewhat good, neither, somewhat nefarious, and very nefarious. So to do this, all you have to have is you have to have each of your artifacts that your respondent was exposed to accounted for with its own variable. And then that coded accordingly with how the respondents were expected to respond to that given variable. Now, naturally, these all have to be measured in the same way. And so he asked the same question for every artifact or every character that the person was exposed to, whether it be the lawyer, the aliens, the guy with the spear, the woman, the leopard, or the bear. And so that being the case, these all got different scores based on how people responded to them and if they thought the character was a depiction of a good character or a nefarious or evil character. So what we want to do is we want to do a statistical test to see if there is a statistically significant difference in the way that people perceived these given characters. Beyond that, we want to see what the individual scores are, and we want to see how they compare to one another. And so to do that, quite simply go to Analyze, General Linear Model, and go to Repeated Measures. Now it's going to ask you for a factor. Your factor is, in the case of your projects, in the case of what you're doing here, your factors are just going to be the artifacts. So with Jackson's project, each artifact represented a given character. So I'm going to call these characters. You could call them artifacts, you can call them whatever, and you just put the number that you have. So I have one for lawyer, alien, spear, woman, leopard, bear. That's 6. So I have 6 different characters, and I'm going to press add. And then from there, you go ahead and click define. And so all you have to do here is just put in order that you want, or in the order that you want, the given artifacts into the 6 available spots here. So I'm going to move the lawyer in, move the aliens in, move the spear guy in, move the woman in, move the leopard in, move the bear in. Okay, now that's all set up. Next, you want to go to EM means, and you want to make sure that for both overall and your given artifacts that these are all pulled in and that it's going to display the means for them. Beyond that, you want to make sure that compare main effects is clicked. That gives you an opportunity to compare individual artifacts to one another to see how they differ. Press continue. I'm also going to go ahead and press plots, and I'm going to pull characters over into a horizontal axis, click add, and I'm going to have a line chart. That line chart is going to allow me to visualize how the different artifacts elicited different responses in terms of people's perceptions of good or nefariousness. So all of that said, that is all set up. You can press OK. And this is what you are going to get. You've got your artifacts specifically associated with numbers here. So you may have to come back and refer to this multiple times when you look at the results, because it does not use the labels. It uses these numbers that are associated with those given artifacts. First, to look at if the overall model of artifacts was significant, and if people responded in distinctly patterned ways based on the artifacts that they saw, you're going to want to look at one of the p-values here. And so the one that you're going to look at is going to be based on if the Macaulay's test of sphericity, I always struggle with that word, but if the Macaulay's test is significant or not. That is testing if a basic assumption of the test is violated, specifically having to do with variance. It would be necessary to go very deep into the weeds to explain that. So I'll just go ahead and explain what it means in terms of your interpretation and limit it to that. So if this test is significant, then you're going to go ahead and use the p-value that's associated with the greenhouse geyser correction. If it is not significant, you're going to use the p-value that's associated with sphericity assumed. In our case, it is statistically significant. So we're going to use the greenhouse geyser correction. Now, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day because all of these are the same. It's a very significant p-value. The p-value for both are less than 0.001. So we would reject the null hypothesis here. And we would say that certainly the overall model of artifacts that we have is showing a distinct pattern. So to get a little bit more into what is happening here, you can see here under estimates, you can see the individual means for the various artifacts. It is the case that artifact 1, which is the lawyer, had a nefariousness score of 1.37. Remember, these are coded, so if a character is perceived as good, it gets a negative code. If a character is perceived as nefarious, it gets a positive code. And so any character that was that has a mean that is above 0 and a positive number is perceived as more nefarious than good. And so the most nefarious character was number 2, which was the aliens. Number 3, the guy with the spear, he was actually perceived as good and not nefarious. He had a score of negative 0.603, so a slight perception of good. These all vary in certain ways. Some are perceived as more nefarious than others, but that is the one character that is perceived as actively good. So the pairwise comparisons allow you to compare each individual artifact to every other individual artifact. So if you want to compare number 1, which is the lawyer, to all the other characters, you can see that number 1, when compared to number 2 is the aliens. So the lawyer has a score that is negative 0.042 less. So about a half a point less in the nefarious score. So both are considered to be nefarious, but the aliens are considered to be a little bit more nefarious than the lawyer. If we compare the lawyer to number 3, which is the spear guy, the lawyer's score is almost 2 whole points higher on the nefarious scale, which tells us that the lawyer was generally considered to be much more nefarious than was the spear guy. So any difference that is statistically significant is flagged here. It gives you a p-value for almost all of them, and most of these differences are statistically significant. There are some that are not, but it looks like the vast majority of them are. And so when comparing most of the artifacts to one another, there are statistically significant differences that we can interpret in terms of the perceived nefariousness or goodness of these given characters. And so at the bottom here, you can see through the artifacts how these all differ. And so you can see the nefarious scores are relatively high for all of them. There is some variance with some being considered more nefarious than others. So once again, here's the lawyer, here's the aliens being a little bit more nefarious, and then there's a big drop for number three. Number three being the guy with the spear. The spear guy falls below the 0 point, which is the bright line between good and nefarious, and he is seen as slightly good. And then once we move on to the other characters here, we once again have greater perceptions of nefariousness that vary one way or another, but are all above that 0 point, all signifying that they are seen as nefarious to one degree or another.